All right.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see you here at the UCLA Tribal Legal Development Clinic Brown Bag Series. Welcome, happy Friday. I am Lauren Van Schilfgaarde, Director of the clinic, and I am very happy and grateful to see everyone. Happy day after McGirt decision. I'm definitely still riding that wave. I'm sure you are too. It was very nice to go to bed last night. But I am especially happy to welcome today Derrick Beetso and Fatima Abbas for our last but certainly not least Brown Bag series. Derrick Beetso currently serves as the General Counsel for the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI, where he handles all of the in-house legal needs of the organization and co-manages the Tribal Supreme Court project, which, hey, happens to be super relevant today. And Fatima Abbas works also at NCAI as the Policy Director and Legislative Counsel. She supervises the NCAA policy team and works on legislative issues across a range of subject matters. So between the two of them, we could pretty much talk about anything impacting Indian country. So we have intentionally left it pretty open-ended. This brown bag, of course, is called Advocating for Indian Country, and it seems especially relevant today in a COVID world, in a McGirt world, in a Black Lives Matter world. There are just so many different issues going on simultaneously. And so I am especially grateful and eager to talk to two attorneys who are doing everything all the time. Perhaps we can have some introductions from Derrick and Fatima. Welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. Derrick, you want to go first?
Sure. Derrick Beetso Yenishin, certification in Kanazani Bashichi, Kia Ani Doshache, Ado, Tachini, Doshanella, Akotego, Dene, Nishle. Lauren, thank you for inviting us here. Like Lauren said, my name is Derrick Beetso. I serve as General Counsel to the National Congress of American Indians. And at NCAI, it's my honor and my privilege to work with tribal nations on a variety of different issues. Probably my most outward-facing issue is co-staffing the Tribal Supreme Court project, along with the Native American Right Fund. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but I also want to give a chance for Fatima to give some introductions as well.
Thank you, Derrick. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fatima Abbas. I'm Hawa Saponi of North Carolina, and as Lauren mentioned, my title at NCAI is Director of Policy and Legislative Counsel, and I work within our Government Relations Department. That's a 7-member team. We cover a range of subjects, everything from child welfare to environmental protection to economic development, and I supervise 4 members of our team, and we're growing and adding on 2 more folks.
Great, thank you, Fatima. Thank you, Derrick. Well, Derrick, you mentioned the Supreme Court project, and I think we all would love to hear more about that, especially after yesterday.
Sure, no problem. So the Supreme Court project is something that's near and dear to my heart. I think it's, it's got a fascinating history. The way it started was somewhere around the late 1990s. There were a string of really negative Supreme Court decisions that really rocked the Indian country. One of them being, Nevada v. Hicks, another one being Cotton Petroleum. And those deal a lot with regulatory jurisdiction within the reservation, but involving state interests. And tribes were on the losing side of those, along with a couple other cases around that time. So around 2001, as lore would have it, a bunch of tribal leaders and NCAI and NARF were meeting in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, 2001. And when 9/11 happened, everything got locked down. And so the tribal leaders and NCAI and NARF were stuck in the basement of a building in Washington, D.C. and came up with this Sovereignty Protection Initiative. And part of the Sovereignty Protection Initiative was this idea to have a tribal Supreme Court project. And so from 2001 until now, the Supreme Court project has been working hand in hand with tribes to try to make sure that we monitor cases that are going up to the Supreme Court, that are Supreme Court worthy, to try to monitor different fact patterns and try to help with amicus strategy and really creating a network of some of the most brilliant minds in Indian country working in Indian law to try to make sure that when cases do make it up to the Supreme Court, that they do so in an organized fashion and that we're working together to try to put forward the most, I guess, strongest arguments on behalf of tribal interests. And so, I say all that because I think a lot of people, don't understand that history or don't really know the origins of the Supreme Court project. And I always found it fascinating. So I like to tell people about that. So, fast forward to 2018, 2019 terms of the Supreme Court. One of the things that NCAI is very active in is also vetting and taking I guess, active participation within the judicial nominations process. And so one of the justices that we nominate, that we supported their nomination very strongly was Justice Neil Gorsuch. And we have followed him, at the 10th Circuit and seen some of the decisions he made at the 10th Circuit and, with respect to tribal interests, and thought that that he had a strong understanding of federal Indian law. And so, with 2018 and 2019 October term, he had a really strong concurrence in the Cougar Den case. And then yesterday's opinion, if everybody's had a chance to read it, was just, everything that we could wish for in a Supreme Court opinion with these facts before them. And so we're really happy, that we feel like we played, some sort of a small role in Indian country in helping to vet this justice and really seeing him through to see him take a seat on the court and have such an impact right away with Indian law. My colleague, Joel West Williams, who co-staffs the project with me, he likes to bring out all the statistics and the data. And I think up until yesterday, I think Neil Gorsuch had sided with tribal interests for 75% of the cases that he's been on that address tribal issues on the Supreme Court already. And obviously he doesn't have as many cases as other justices by far, but those numbers were telling. And then yesterday's decision was just a really welcome surprise in Indian country. For those of you who haven't been following the McGirt decision, it's the second case with the second set of patterns that are very similar that dealt with the same issue. It was a reservation disestablishment case, and the first case was a Sharp versus Murphy case out there in Oklahoma. It had a similar fact pattern. You had an individual that was prosecuted for murder within Oklahoma, and he was tried under state law, prosecuted under state law, and he brought an appeal that made its way up through the 10th Circuit and found its way to the Supreme Court. Notably, that first case, that Murphy case, was pushed over to the October 2018 term for further briefing. That briefing, the oral arguments never happened in the 2019 term, and instead they took up this other case, McGirt versus Oklahoma, which had a very similar fact pattern, but didn't come out of the 10th Circuit. And the reason why that's notable here is because Justice Neil Gorsuch used to sit on the 10th Circuit. And a lot of folks feel like the reason why he recused himself from Murphy in 2018 was because he was on the 10th Circuit, which decided the Murphy decision and probably thought there was a potential conflict there. And so now, we have this McGirt versus Oklahoma decision that didn't come out of the 10th Circuit. Instead, came out of an appeal from the state of Oklahoma, and the ground was set for, a nine-panel judges to review the case, right? And so yesterday's decision came on the heels of all that history, and it was the very last case decided on the last day. Well, not the last case, but decided on the last day of cases for the October 2019 term. So they really kept us on the edge of our seats. And so, reading the opinion, I think, halfway through the first couple of pages, I think everybody was just ecstatic. And I even found myself looking again to make sure that this was the October 2019 term and just trying to, double check all that. And, NCAI, and NARF and a bunch of folks who were sending around emails, just really happy and ecstatic about it. And I think Indian country's still riding that wave. And I think what we're seeing is, for in the most recent Supreme Court opinion, really standing strong on these ideas and principles of upholding treaty promises, and really necessitating a clear intent from Congress in order to break treaty promises. And some of the language with respect to states and the federal role, with respect to federal Indian law was really refreshing to hear. For those of you students who've been practicing or who tend to practice in federal Indian law, and who have been studying federal Indian law, one of the big principles that you learn in school is that, the tribal governments have a federal trust responsibility owed to them from the federal government. And a large part of that, at least in the way that it's shaped throughout the years, is that the federal government has this implied role or sometimes explicit role to protect tribes from state interests. And if you recall, when I started talking, I was talking about the Hicks case and the Cotton Petroleum case. What we started seeing from the Supreme Court, in the late 90s was this this tendency to side with state interests over tribal interests. And so now, 2020, we have this strong McGirt decision that basically says, you don't just, look at the history of what's happened within the state if it's wrong. If it's, a history or a pattern of something that's outside the law, you still have to look at treaties as the supreme law of the land. And so, I'm happy to get into a little bit further. I'm pretty sure there are going to be some questions on it. But, that's a big case, and I'm glad, that this presentation happened to come on the heels of that. It wasn't planned, but all the better to be able to discuss it and talk about it with you all. So I'll go ahead and stop there and kick it over to Fatima if she wants to talk about some of the things that she's doing, and then maybe we could just get into a back and forth with everybody.
Sure. So hi, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, I work on policy, and that's largely legislative work in Congress. And one of the main activities that our whole government relations team has been working on is the various COVID bills. They're called COVID stimulus bills. And we've been working on them since the first two passed in early March. As many of you have probably heard, the CARES Act that passed in May was the largest aid package in US history for any government, but especially for Indian country. It included over 10 billion in direct relief for Indian country. It's a humongous amount, especially when you look at just one of the provisions for health. IHS was provided over $1 billion in health, and that's a department that is chronically underfunded. And so our government relations team, along with other advocates within Indian country, have been working on not only passing those bills, but getting the funds from those bills. Unfortunately for Indian country, there's been significant delays in the disbursement of those funds, and they were meant to be emergency funds, but to date there's over $2 billion that has not been fully distributed out of the CARES Act for direct tribal relief. Some of that is money from the Treasury Department, some of it's education funds. And so we're working heavily on that. And then I'm sure a lot of you have heard that there's likely another stimulus package that's going to get passed before the August recess. So right now in Congress, even though the Senate is in recess, their staff are heavily working on the next package. And what makes the news is the individual economic support payments, but the increased appropriations into existing programs is a big focus. And for tribal nations, the focus is on increasing appropriations to the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That's the fund that provided $8 billion to tribal government. So we're aggressively working on that within the next 2 weeks. And happy to answer any questions about that. I'm sure many of you have heard about some of the litigation that came out of the CARES Act.
Just a little bit. Oh my gosh. So obviously this is a can of worms, and on the one hand you note that this is the largest stimulus package that has ever been provided to tribes, and on the other hand it's certainly long overdue, but very much so in light of the need. And the litigation seems to really have been the cherry on top. Could you talk a little bit about sort of at least as much as possible in this confined time, what that litigation has looked like and the role that NCAI has played?
Sure, and I'll actually turn it over to Derrick on that. He was involved with the amicus brief.
Sure, thanks, Lauren. So this litigation comes on the heels of the CARES Act that Fatima was just describing. And Title V of the CARES Act was set up to provide governmental relief to states, locals, and tribal governments. And so what's really, at the core of this is what is an Indian tribe or a tribal government for purposes of Title V. When Congress passed the bill, they had two definitions within Title V. One was Indian tribal government, and they used the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act. And the other definition was tribal government, which was kind of an offshoot of that Indian tribal government definition. The definition of the tribal government said any governing body of an Indian tribe. And so you basically had to tie the two definitions together to figure out what Congress was saying. The litigation basically involves whether or not Congress intended that government relief funds go to Alaska Native corporations. As those of you all who are in the weeds in federal Indian law understand, the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act has a definition that does include Alaska Native corporations, but there's this whole technical kind of language dispute that came out through the litigation about how that language is worded and what it means. And so a lot of that had to do with what's called an eligibility clause. Within the definition of Indian tribe within the Self-Determination Act, there's a comma, and then it says which are eligible for programs and services provided to Indians because of their status as Indian. So that's been the whole clause that a lot of the litigations focus around. The team from Chehalis and Cheyenne River Sioux joined about 16 other tribes in litigating on behalf of tribal governments, basically stating that their understanding is that the government relief fund was intended for Indian tribal governments with governing authority over their lands and their resources, and not intended for state chartered corporations like Alaska Native corporations. And so NCAI's role has been to work as amici with other partner organizations to support the tribal position in this litigation. We've participated in the preliminary stages and also on the merits brief at the district court, submitted two amicus briefs, basically outlining our contours and understanding of what a tribal government is and what tribal governments provide to their citizens and communities. And so, our briefs are available. I'm happy to share those with folks. Right now, the district court recently ruled in favor of the Treasury Department and the ANCs, and said that their understanding is that when Congress passed the CARES Act, that they intended that ANCs be able to receive some of that funding. That was a ruling in the district court. The district court was very careful to limit that strictly to the facts of this case, basically saying they weren't weighing in on whether or not an ANC has a broader status as a federally recognized Indian tribe. And as a matter of fact, they were saying they were not federally recognized Indian tribes. But for purpose of CARES Act funding, they really thought that the intent of Congress was such that they intended ANCs to receive funding. That's on appeal right now. The Chehalis plaintiffs were able to get an injunction pending appeal to the DC Circuit Court. And so right now, that funding that Fatima was alluded to earlier that was being held back by Treasury is still being held back by court order until this, there's a date certain, I believe sometime in, I want to say September 12th, perhaps might be the date, or the resolution of the circuit court proceeding when the money can be released. And so right now, NCI is probably preparing to participate again at the circuit court level as amici, and there's going to be a number of facts that the plaintiffs have to try to figure out what kind of arguments they're going to make. And then NCAI will be working to try to support the tribal plaintiffs in that litigation. But it is, I like to call it the octopus litigation, because there's so many different arms and angles and different types of approaches to it, so many different tribes involved. There's about 3 different issues that were kind of wrapped into this whole litigation framework that are outside of this question that I described earlier, but kind of related to the funds and how the funds get released. And all of that, hats off to Judge Mehta for being able to navigate all that process. He's the judge of the district court, and he's just been, trying his best to try to work on an expedited schedule, work with all the different parties and the interests, and try to figure out, what that looks like at the district court. But that's, a brief summary of that. I'm sure there'll be questions that come up, and so I don't want to take up too much time, but I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Derrick's comment about it being an octopus case, it really is, and it's a microcosm of the issues with implementation of the CARES Act, but also broader structural issues dealing with the federal government's engagement with tribal nations, and what consultation looks like on the back end, or ignoring tribal comments even after consultation. So one of the additional issues at play in that case is that once a portion of the funds were dispersed, 60%, Treasury hadn't disclosed the formula that it was going to use initially, and then when they announced the disbursement, they decided to use Indian housing block grant data, which is based on census data, and that was in complete disregard to the data that they had solicited from tribes regarding tribal expenditures, tribal enrollment, tribal land base, and so tribes thought that the formula would be based on those metrics, and Treasury ignored that data. There was also a data breach, and all of the data that tribes had submitted was the public was able to access it. But in using that housing block data, about 20 tribes were listed as having 0 populations, which is ridiculous because you wouldn't exist if you didn't have if you had no population. Based on those numbers, though, those tribes only got the minimum distribution of 100,000, and Treasury declined to address the inaccuracies in the formula in regards to those tribes, basically saying, well, you should have pushed back on your numbers within that housing formula, and those tribes not knowing that that housing formula would apply to a Treasury distribution. So the cases that are involved within the CRF litigation really illustrate a mixture of issues, from the importance of census data to formulas that are created, the lack of notice that tribes are given, what negotiated rulemaking means, and the consequences of having consultation without enforcement, and also the fact that the Treasury Department has, outside of the Internal Revenue Service and their Department of Tribal Governments and an advisory committee, they don't have any infrastructure for interacting with tribes. And so it was essentially assembled for the purpose of the CARES Act, and the numerous distribution issues that we see are a reflection of a department, and one of the most important departments within the federal government, really having no engagement, no understanding of their trust responsibility to tribal nations. So I encourage you all to read those cases because they touch upon a range of federal Indian law and policy issues.
Well, gosh, all of these are cans of worms. I'd like to remind all of our attendees that we have a chat box. So when the inevitable question comes, I invite you to submit it and we'll get through what we can. But the CARES Act and the debacle that is the distribution of that funding, right, is just one small component of the issues that tribes are facing with COVID. I wonder what, if any, exposure NCAI has to some of the on-the-ground issues that tribes are facing with COVID, and what, comparisons and contrasts you're seeing across the country.
So we have another department called our Policy Research Center, and they've actually been doing surveys with tribal nations across the country, pulling data, soliciting data about how COVID is impacting them, from access to PPE to issues related to overcrowding, to the effect of tribal layoffs. And some of that data actually was utilized in the litigation that Derrick mentioned. Derrick, it was in our amicus brief, I believe?
Yeah, we actually had a declaration put together from Dr. Rubidoux, the director of the Policy Research Center, and she presented a lot of that data. We used it to tie to basically what governments are doing to combat COVID right now. And yeah, Fatima, go ahead. I know you're going to say some other things. I'll come in after you.
Sure. So I would encourage you all to read that declaration, because that comes directly from data from tribes from Alaska Native villages to tribes in Arizona. And it's showing a mixture of issues, but one of the commonalities is that this COVID and this pandemic, which is ongoing, was essentially the perfect storm for because Indian country, the chronic underfunding of the trust and treaty responsibility had created such disparate conditions, whether it's infrastructure, health, or economic development within Indian country, that once COVID entered a community, it essentially spread like wildfire. And what's shocking is to read reports like the Broken Promises report from the US Commission on Civil Rights that came out 2 years ago. And it was almost foretelling what was happening. Their statements and the ample documentation that they provide talk about an existing crisis in 2018 and the difficulties that Indian country would encounter within public health, within all these other areas that we're now seeing. So that's some of how NCI has been engaging, at least on the research collection, because in order to pass these bills, we have to provide legislators the data showing tribal needs. So for example, we identified that there is at least $20 billion that tribes need in direct relief for governments and their enterprises. And that data came from tribes throughout the nation, including within California, based on their lost revenue that their casinos were experiencing. And that lost revenue is what feeds the government services, whether it's nutrition or elder care. And so that all of that is that the data collection is all interconnected to the advocacy.
And I just note that Fatima's team has been really instrumental in preparing our president, Fawn Sharp, to testify in various different venues on all of these issues, and all that testimony is available online. If it's not, we'll be happy to send it to you. I'd also note that the National Congress of American Indians is made up of a 501c3 and a 501c4. Our C4 is our advocacy arm, where we interact with Congress and try to push for changes in legislation. And our C3 is your public education kind of nonprofit that people typically think of when they think of a nonprofit. A lot of funders have been asking us if we have a need for COVID resources, and they've been giving us money through our C3, and our development team has been really instrumental in pushing that money out to Indian country and micro grants. So we've really been trying to work with tribes on trying to help them fund maybe PPE needs, or maybe some kind of elder care needs, or any type of needs that have come up with COVID. We have modest funding up to about $5,000 cap that we're making available. We funded over about between 20 and 30 entities right now. A lot of them tribal governments proper, but some of them are elder care, some of them are child care. So, if you guys are from a tribal nation and need $5,000 micro grant, get in touch with us too. We can give you the application process and then have you fill that out, and we'd be happy to try to help if we can.
Thanks. Before we pivot away from the COVID topic, we had one question regarding the CARES Act litigation. Wondering if during all of this argument of whether or not Alaska Native corporations would be included, have Alaska Native villages received their CARES Act distributions? And if so, what are the corporations saying they're going to use their funding for, presuming there's overlap between those two?
Yeah, so my understanding is all the villages have received their money. They have received their money, and I think the Alaska Native villages, if you read the briefing, they make the argument that they provide services that a government will provide to Alaska Natives on the ground in Alaska. And so if they do receive their share of funding, they've said that they'll fund, things that are similar to what a government will fund in Alaska. They also make the point that there are some pockets in Alaska that don't have tribal governments, but have Alaska Natives that are enrolled in tribal governments, and that they kind of serve as a stopgap to provide services to these Alaska Natives in Alaska. So, it's a complex litigation. I encourage you guys to read the briefing. A lot of the briefings available online, and so there's a lot of different angles and approaches to this litigation. It's not simple by any means. It's very complex, and there's a lot of different kind of layers to it.
Like hilariously complex. Well, I said we were going to pivot, but we actually got a really good question that harks to some of the inter-tribal state conflict that we're seeing rise. AKA South Dakota. But the question is, are there any states and tribes that have risen up as good models for tribal state cooperation during this public health crisis?
I can speak from a policy front. I think that California has, I would say the California governor's tribal liaison, Christina Snyder, has done a phenomenal job in outreaching to tribes to understand what the issues are throughout the state, North, South, Central, Eastern California. For about 3 months, she had a weekly, sometimes bi-weekly call with tribal leaders that would provide updates on state policies and other matters impacting tribal nations. And then she also invited NCAI, National Indian Gaming Association, and others to provide federal updates so that tribal leaders in California were briefed on what was happening at the federal level. And through those weekly meetings, tribal leaders were able to get connected to the right state folks, or if they were having difficulty hearing back, they were basically able to put them on blast at those weekly meetings. And then it was incredibly helpful for those of us working at the federal level to hear the issues that tribal leaders were encountering. So for example, early on, we heard that tribal leaders that were receiving PPE from IHS were receiving old and expired PPE, and we definitely notified members of Congress about that. And so I would consider that to be a good example of engagement and being her willingness to put in the time to listen to tribal leaders, and those calls would go beyond the scheduled 1 hour. As long as they had questions, she would stay on the line. So I think she is a good example.
Yeah, thanks. And also an example of a state that's built in infrastructure and priority to make space for that, right?
Yeah.
Still lots of work to be done.
Yes.
Okay, well, pivoting just a little bit, there's so much on the agenda, but given the momentum right now around law enforcement reform bills, do you have any sense of where Indian country and its public safety needs fit into that dimension and overall national discussion that's going on?
Derrick, do you want to take
Sure,
that?
I guess I can. Sure, I can talk a little bit about this. So early on, after the unfortunate George Floyd incident, there was a groundswell of support for some sort of police reform, as everybody who's been following social media and the news is aware of. There were a lot of calls for defunding the police and creating rights of action against police officers that were not as easy as they were before. And so there were various legislation that was introduced. NCAI's role in all of that is, we definitely support the Black Lives Matter movement. We've been very vocal about that. But sometimes in working with our partners in the civil rights realm, we have to do some education on our own. I'll take, for example, one of the racial profiling components of one of the bills that was proposed initially as drafted would have applied to tribal police officers on the same way it would apply to other officers. And we had to educate our partners in the civil rights realm and let them know that, with respect to tribal law enforcement, their only authority is over Indians. And so, to have them be subject to a racial profiling, I guess, ban would, in some instances, empower, defense attorneys on the reservation to call every time a tribal officer makes a determination that's a jurisdictional determination, call that potentially racial profiling, right? So we had to work with them to understand the differences in Indian country and try to craft a language in a way that exempted tribes from that particular provision. We were successful in doing that, and also trying to let them know that with respect to Indian country, what we've been hearing from our tribal leaders, for a number of years, is that tribal law enforcement is woefully underfunded, and that there's a lack of police officers on the reservation to meet the needs that that are required to provide adequate public safety on the reservation. So we've been trying to work with them in a lot of ways to support, some of the principles that are being fought for on the Hill with respect to law enforcement reform, but at the same time trying to make sure that we protect the Indian country's interests and that we still make sure that tribes, can still advance the ball with respect to public safety, on the reservation and protecting Native communities. So that's been, kind of our role. There's been, a couple of bills introduced at this point, and the civil rights advocates have been very good about looping us in and asking for our perspective because they understand that there are differences in Indian country, and so that's been kind of the role that we've been playing to date.
Thanks. I realize that NCAI predominantly works with tribes, but I wonder, given the extent of police brutality that natives often find themselves the victims of, particularly in urban areas, is NCAI doing any work with urban organizations or urban Indians?
Not with respect to law enforcement, we haven't done a lot of outreach to urban folks. We obviously support all of the reform efforts that are being, developed outside the reservation because we feel like they would include those instances that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And we feel like, there are a lot of areas where those instances could be addressed by those issues. I think a lot of our focus, we're a resolution-based organization. And so what that means is we're a Congress, as our name would indicate and suggest. And what our Congress does is it creates a forum. All our meetings, our conferences are basically forums to bring tribal leaders together and pass resolutions that become the marching orders of us as employees of the National Congress of American Indians. So right now, the majority of our resolutions are focused on within Indian country jurisdiction and law enforcement and what that looks like in protecting and preserving resources for that type of public safety approach. And we don't have resolutions on the books now that would get into what you're talking about. And so really, the Congress, I advise folks, I recommend that folks be engaged in some of the stuff that we do because we are the oldest and largest national organization made up of tribal governments. The tribal governments make us up and individual Indians. We have individual Indian membership too. And so when we pass these resolutions, a large majority of our resolutions are passed and are introduced and go through the resolution process and are passed by tribal governments. But we also have resolutions put forward by individual Indians as members as well. We have, a standing resolution on Leonard Peltier, his situation that was put forward by an individual Indian that we, were able to send a letter to the White House on a couple of weeks ago. So that's just one example, but I think a lot of folks don't understand that it's tribal governments and individual Indians that NCAI represents. So encourage you guys, if you are interested in this issue and if you guys are thinking that NCAI should be doing more in that space, come participate in the Congress, pull forward a resolution, work it through the process and see where it goes.
Yeah, it's individual Indian resolution. Got it. Are non-federally recognized tribes eligible to be members of NCAI?
We do have membership for state recognized tribes that meet certain criteria. So in our Constitution, there's, different, you have to be federally recognized tribe, or if you're a state tribe, your state has to have a certain kind of internal process for determining state membership and recognition, and that information has to be submitted to the organization and it has to be signed off on by the rules committee, and then then there's an opportunity for membership. So right now I would say we have I want to say between I want to say over 20 members that are state recognized tribes. I could be off on that, so don't quote me, but we do have state recognized tribes that are members of NCAI.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Might turn into one of my resolutions of like eligible for federal recognition status. So I want to move a little bit to this policy work that you're so engaged with, and especially because I'm feeling optimistic after yesterday. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about, despite being in a generally anti-Indian administration, how has the presence of 2 Native women in Congress impacted your work?
Sure. So I'll take that question. So I know that the phrase representation matters is something that we've all heard in diversity spaces. You hear it in school. In Congress, it especially matters because Congress is an institution of influence, and it's usually influence based on wealth, even though it shouldn't be, and various stakeholders that are usually your constituents. And so what tribal advocates often have difficulty doing is having members of Congress engaged on a tribal issue when they don't have tribes within their district, or if they have only a limited number of tribes within their district. And so outside of constituents, what influences members of Congress are their colleagues, and their colleagues sit on various committees. They also sit on task forces, and they sit on caucuses. And so I say all of that to kind of lay the foundation of how influence works within Congress. Within the 116th Congress, we had 2 Native women join within the House, Representative Sharice Davids in Kansas and Representative Deb Haaland in New Mexico. And they were placed onto different committees within the House. Representative Haaland is on natural resource. She chairs a subcommittee within natural resource, and Representative Haaland, Representative Davids is involved in infrastructure. And so I've seen in my work on the Hill across a variety of issues, their colleagues who are non-Native, who have never been interested in tribal matters, suddenly express support, and not just express support, but like join a letter of support that has had an impact on various matters. So for example, one of the issues that we saw within the CARES Act was tribal businesses being able to access the PPP loan, which is a forgivable loan within the Small Business Association. Originally, tribal casinos there was a series of restrictions that were added that basically made it impossible for them to apply. And so as a result, a lot of tribal casinos were on the cusp of laying off 200 to 300 employees. Tribal advocates have been pressuring Treasury and the SBA to change that determination. Representative Davids, along with others, led a letter to the SBA and Treasury, and that was a letter that numerous individuals within the Small Business Committee and others signed on to, and they signed on basically in support of her, not because they all had tribes in their district or because they cared about casinos being eligible for the PPP, but because she asked them to do that, and because she is the only Native woman on that committee, he did it out of respect for her. And so having that representation on that committee within other committees, Representative Haaland within the Women's Caucus, they're influencing their colleagues and also raising their consciousness, and that's having an impact nationally on tribal advocacy. And it's been really incredible to see, because I personally was excited when they were elected, just as like a fangirl of both of them, but then to see the actual impact day to day on them just being in the room and being in a place where this institution, Congress, is based on the erasure of Native people, and having them there in that body as legislators, it's having such a widespread impact, and is why we need more Native people. Oops, sorry, my camera. More Native people within Congress, and also bipartisan, because while they are members of the Democratic Party, the House Native Caucus is bipartisan, and the co-chair is Representative Cole, and he's been incredibly influential in bringing his party on board for certain tribal provisions, particularly within the CARES Act.
He was cited in just a recent Supreme Court case doing exactly that. That's Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah, visibility seems to be a theme that is continuously coming up, right? With Gorsuch, just exposure to Indian issues, having representation in Congress, just exposure to Indian issues. And it's coming up now in media with particular NFL teams and logos. I know NCAI has been long involved in the Not Your Mascot campaign. And I wonder if this wave feels different, or is this just the next step that's been part of a long and exhausting campaign to sort of correct some of the harmful Native imagery that's out in the mass media?
Derrick, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, I think to answer your question, I think definitely feels different. I think as a nation, I think we're really in a different space now. I think we're really taking, you know, as a whole, a more internal look at a lot of these different issues in our society. You know, a lot of that started, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of that has been amplified because we're all stuck at home, you know, with this pandemic situation, and have a lot of, you know, introspection going on here as a nation. And I think part of that, you know, was really, you know, where do Indigenous people in our histories kind of fit into that fold? And I think a lot of people are looking at things a little bit differently. You've seen there's been public statements from both the National Football League and the Washington football team on this particular issue that have been a little bit more progressive than statements we've seen in the past. There's been a lot of dialogue. I heard there was an excellent evening presentation put on by Illuminatives this past week, and I'm unable to see it, but I heard it was really good and very well done. So I think we are in a different place, and I think there's a lot of momentum, you know, in general with seeking equity, you know, with respect to Black and Indigenous and people of color in general, and so I think there's a movement, you know, that's afoot, and I think, like you said, NCI has been pushing, you know, this rock up the hill for, you know, almost 50 years at this point, and so, you know, it's really encouraging to see. I think you have a lot of folks that are looking at, you know, what's going on in this nation, and, you know, trying to imagine a better tomorrow, and trying to be, you know, active and trying to make sure that that is realized. And you know, so NCAI is just happy to play a role in that, and just, you know, trying to figure out how we can work with our partners to help kind of capitalize on the momentum from this current era.
Thank you. I don't know where the time went, but looking towards the future, as we are inclined to do, what opportunities do you see to push more on issues of climate change, especially as they're disproportionately impacting tribal communities within your policy work?
Sure. I'll take that. And then Derrick also works on climate change with our Climate Action Task Force. I think within the 116th Congress, we've seen such a shift in opinions on climate change. It's pretty much recognized that we're in a global, national, and local climate crisis. At the beginning of the Congress, we saw President Trump announce that he was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. New representatives were sworn in, like AOC, and she introduced the idea. It wasn't a piece of legislation, but just the idea of the Green New Deal, which had very broad goals about reducing carbon emissions substantially. Out of all of that, we saw the creation of a House committee on the climate crisis that was bipartisan, and the bipartisan nature of that committee, which was focused on analyzing legislation that could address a myriad of issues within climate change. That resulted in there being both a majority and minority climate package within the House. And just the fact that the minority, which are Republicans within the House of Representatives, have put forward a climate package. This was in January, which feels like years ago. It's just reflective of a huge shift that the country recognizes that we're in a climate crisis. And so the question is, how do you respond? And there's various frameworks for responding, from carbon emission reductions to mitigation and adaptation. And for tribes, they have interests within all of those areas. Some tribes are frontline essentially victims of climate change and experiencing rising waters. Other tribes are impacted by discussions about transitioning energy because they're energy producers, and so they have a stake in those conversations, because moving away from coal or natural gas, or whatever form of extraction has an impact on their tribal communities' employment, but also the delivery of essential government services, which is funded from that revenue. So tribes have been heavily engaged. The House majority recently issued a report, that Special Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and there was numerous mention of tribes in there, and that's because tribal leaders directly engaged with that committee. And all of that provides foundation for the work that's going to be done in the 117th Congress, but also potentially for different climate issues to be attached to bills that are still going to move within the 116th Congress. So outside of the COVID stimulus packages, we're looking at an infrastructure bill that's going to move, and that's because there's reauthorizations for surface transportation and water resources development. And so frequently there's various provisions that get attached to those bills. There's also national defense reauthorization. Again, that's something where various provisions have nothing to do with defense frequently get added to that bill. And then there's appropriations to annually fund the government. And so there's potential for various climate issues to be attached to those bills. Some of it involves climate financing and making that more accessible to governments. And tribes are looking to ensure parity so that if state, local governments get funding, tribes don't have to go through the state, or they don't have to compete with the state. They should be able to get direct funding. So there's a lot of opportunities both in the remainder of this Congress, but especially within the next Congress, because the conversation has changed on both sides.
Yeah, and I would just add that climate change and the issues that surround it go hand in hand with tribal self-governance. I think when you think about the land and the resources that the federal government sets aside for tribes, whether it be in treaty or executive order or otherwise, that was intended to be to serve as permanent homelands for present and future generations. And so I think tribes are unique with respect to other non-Indians, because we can't just pick up and leave. Our lands and our resources are directly tied to who we are as a people. And so when you think about climate change, I think about, tribal food sovereignty. What does it mean to make tribes more self-dependent, in their local communities, and be able to provide food and sustenance to themselves? What does it mean to exercise, off-reservation treaty hunting and fishing rights? All of those things are related to climate change, intimately. And so then you get into issues of like co-management of like adjacent federal lands. All these things are things that we're working on. Is Fatima mentioned a lot of things, before the Hill in Congress, but also working with tribes on trying to present, better priorities and policies for self-governance that kind of take into account what it means to create a better framework for a permanent homeland. That's my buzzer. I guess my time is up.
Oh, thank you. Well, we have one more minute, I think. I apologize, we have questions in the queue, which is so great. But Derrick, Fatima, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
I'll go after Derrick.
and no is perfectly fine.
No problem. I mean, I would just say go Bruins. I used to work at, in the previous life, I used to work at the UCLA finance office on Wilshire and Westwood. So Bruins are always near and dear to my heart. I just encourage young professionals and folks that are going to school, with a future career in federal Indian law, to really pay attention to the era that we're in. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to create change and create a better tomorrow. And I think that's what we're all in this here together to do. And so I just appreciate your time, Lauren. thanks for reaching out to NCAI and helping us share our story with your audience. So appreciate it.
Just to follow up on Derrick, I agree. It's a really fascinating time to be an attorney because so many areas of the law are being challenged or tested, whether it's within Indian law or outside. I would really encourage the students to consider jobs in policy, especially on the Hill. When I was in law school, I really didn't even know that world existed for lawyers. I thought people who did policy, like they just couldn't be litigators, so they did policy with like law degrees. Like I was very ignorant, and I spent the majority of my career in pretty traditional legal practice, whether it was litigation or in-house counsel. And I've been doing policy work for the past year, and it's incredibly fascinating to see how laws get made and how quickly they can get made based on the changing shifts in public opinion. And so, while all this litigation is going on regarding these COVID bills, there's numerous technical amendments that are being proposed, and it's really fascinating to see the opportunity to change the law instead of litigating it. And so I would really encourage folks that are interested to outreach to me. I'm happy to put them in touch with folks who've worked on the Hill, and also look for opportunities there, because there are opportunities for attorneys, counsel positions, but then a lot of folks also work in non-attorney positions too. And from what I've seen of other folks' trajectories, it's very fluid. They can jump in and out of law and policy. So don't feel like you have to commit to that area if you want to work on the Hill for a year or two.
Great plug, love it. Derrick and Fatima, we cannot thank you enough. It's so incredibly inspiring to see Indigenous attorneys advocating on behalf of Indigenous peoples, including having capable ones doing that work. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, expertise, and exposure to these issues with us. It's incredibly appreciated. For all of our attendees, thank you so much for attending. I hope that this was helpful and enjoyable. This, of course, is recorded, and we will be posting it promptly on our website and social media. Here at UCLA, we anticipate having a new round of programming starting with the new school year, and so we will be sure to share and update that. If there are certain things that you would like to see more of, please let us know. Our goal here is just to interact and discuss things that are going on in Indian country, which happens to be a lot. Derrick and Fatima, we wish you a safe weekend and Godspeed in all of your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren, for the invite.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.